All right. Welcome to all of us now that we're here and there in many different places. We have people here in the room. We have one person joining us online. So let me get my screen sharing going so that we can see what I am putting up in front of people. Actually, I'm going to switch over to here, and I'll bring this back over to here. All right, we're in week number 4. Week number 4.
Does she have a book?
I'm not sure that our online guest has a book, but everything in the book will be shown up on the screen for her to see, and for everybody to see. So that is the advantage of doing it this way. And like I said, we're in week number 4. So we're going to continue our mix of different Bible study curriculums that we're pulling together. The first of which is another video from the Bible Project people. I'm going to see if I can solve this real quick, because that bothers me to have that little thing. And I'll see if that fixes it at all. Nope. I've got this little notification down here at the bottom saying sharing screen, and it kind of covers up some of the stuff. But anyway, I'm talking too much. Let me just start the video playing. And actually, there's one more thing I wanted to double check. I'm going to share my screen and make sure it is optimized for video clip. That is something I did not select. Okay. This video, it continues just to introduce us to what the Bible is before we dive too deeply into its content. Though we did talk last week about the opening chapter and the opening 2 chapters, actually, of the Bible with the creation accounts. But this is one of those videos that gives us kind of an overview of all that's in it. So let's just watch it and see what it has to say. And pushing play. Yeah, I can't hear it right now, so hold on one second.
You got a mute button there.
Yep, it's not muted. Select a speaker. Maybe that's it. I'll see here. Oh, that's right. I know what it is. Give me a moment. I have muted the video itself. There's so many different levels of volume that I have to keep track of here. Okay, so now that that is done, I might need to actually quit this window. Otherwise, that's going to be competing with us for a second here. I'll put this back, I'll put this back, and I'll put this back, and we'll try it again. Pushing play.
The Bible is a collection of many books, telling one unified story from beginning to end. But all those books were written in different literary styles.
Yeah, think of it like walking into a bookstore where every aisle has a different kind of literature. There's history or poetry or nonfiction. And when you choose an aisle and pick up a book, you're going to have very different expectations, different things that you're looking for.
Right, they're all literature, but they communicate in really different ways.
Yes, and so the same thing is true for the Bible. If you don't pay attention to what style it's written in, you will miss out on the brilliance of each book.
So, what are the main types of literature in the Bible?
Well, first and foremost is narrative. It makes up a whopping 43% of the Bible. After that is poetry, which is 33% of the Bible. And then there's what you could call prose discourse, which makes up the remaining 24%.
Nearly half the Bible is narrative.
Yes, and this is no accident. Stories are the most universal form of human communication. Our brains are actually hardwired to take in information through stories.
And stories are really enjoyable. Why is that?
Well, stories stories train us to make sense of the seemingly random events that happen in life by taking those events and then putting them in a sequence. And then together you can start to see the meaning and purpose of it all.
And what links this all together?
Well, good stories always have a character who wants something. And then through these characters, an author can explore life's big questions, like who are we, or what's really important in life. And a good story always involves some kind of conflict.
Some challenge to overcome, just like in our own lives.
And that forces us to think about our own challenges, why there's so much pain or disappointment in the world, and then what can we do about it? And stories usually end with some kind of resolution, giving us hope for our own stories.
Since these are Bible stories, are the characters showing me how I should live?
Yeah, that's not quite the point. Most Bible characters are deeply flawed. You should not be like them. But we are supposed to see ourselves in them, which helps us then see our lives and failures from a new perspective. And without even realizing it, these stories will start to mess with you and change how you see the world and other people and yourself.
Now, there are different types of narrative in the Bible.
Yeah, there's historical narrative, but also narrative parables, short biographical narratives like the four Gospels. We'll look at all these in later videos.
Okay, next up is poetry, which honestly, I don't read a lot of.
Yeah, you're like most people. But 1 out of every 3 chapters in the Bible is poetry.
Yeah, why so much poetry?
Well, poems mainly speak through dense, creative language, linking together images to help us envision the world differently. Poems use lots of metaphor to evoke your emotions and your imagination.
Lots of fancy language, but wouldn't it be easier just to tell me what I need to know?
Well, think about it. In life, we tend to form mental ruts, and we think in these familiar, well-worn paths that are very hard to get out of through logic or reasoning. And what good poetry does is force you off the familiar path into new territory.
Sneaky.
And there's different types of poetry in the Bible. There's lots of types of songs or psalms. There's the reflective poetry of the wisdom books, and then the passionate resistance poetry of the prophets.
Okay, the last big literary type is called Prose Discourse, and it makes up a quarter of the Bible.
Yeah, these are speeches, letters, or essays. And the focus here is building a sequence of ideas or thoughts into one linear argument that requires a logical response. Like, hey, have you thought about this thing? You should also consider how it connects to this other thing. And if you do, then you will see that this is the result. And in light of that conclusion, therefore, you should probably stop doing that one thing so that this other thing will be the outcome.
So you're persuading me with reason.
Yeah, discourse forces you to think logically and consistently and then do something about it. Biblical discourse is found in law collections, in wisdom literature, and the letters written by the apostles.
Okay, so each book of the Bible has one literary style.
No, actually, most books have a primary literary style, like narrative, for example. But then embedded in the narrative, you'll come across poems or parables or a collection of laws. Every biblical book is a unique combination of literary styles.
And to read that book well, I need to be familiar with each literary type and how it works.
Yeah, so you know what to pay attention to and what questions you should ask. But before we look at each type, there's one more unifying feature of biblical literature that's really important and really cool. And that's what we'll explore next.
Okay.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching this Bible.
You're welcome. Let me do one thing here. I'm going to mute my conversation. Oh, wrong one. So that I don't get notifications. Hide alerts, yes. Okay, so how many different literary styles could we identify in the Bible, according to this video anyway? 3 different kinds. And those 3, as at least according to this video, are what?
Narrative.
That's one, the storytelling. What's another one?
Poetry.
Poetry is another one. And what was that third one called? It was
Some discourse.
Prose Discourse, yes. I find that just to be a helpful exercise in what we're about to do. We often think of the Bible as a lot of instruction, a lot of God's word, and this is true in many cases. But the style of writing in it is very significant for how we understand what is being said. For example, what we looked at last week with Genesis chapter 1. That's a chapter that I hope we're very familiar with. What style is that one written in, would you say?
Everything.
A little bit of everything. That's an interesting comment. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with it. You certainly have story going on. You have telling what happened and who was there, and the plot and the resolution. So it was a story being told, but it was being told in a very poetic way, with structure, and not necessarily the rhythm and meter like we understand poetry to be commonly done in today, but the patterns that showed up and the repetition that showed up, those are all poetic tools. And yes, there's a mixture of both of those that happen. And to truly get the most out of it, it is helpful to look at what different styles of writing are present. Any comments on that video before we continue on with our book for today?
I enjoyed it.
Good. I'm glad. I hope you enjoy them, because I use them a lot. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to Unit 4. And here we go. I'm going to pull this out of the way. And all right, and now I'm going to share the screen for Zoom. Don't need to optimize your video. Okay. Like I said, I wish there was a way to get rid of this bar, but maybe I'll figure it out sometime. Okay. So if you're following along in your book, we're on page 58. But otherwise, we can just follow along with the illustrations that are up on the wall in front of us. And I'm actually going to sneak that back up to the top. Okay. This illustration, you can see it's representing Genesis 1 here on the top, but then Genesis chapters 2 through 11 down at the bottom. So starting off just with the top half of page 58. This is kind of an exercise. If you recall what we talked about last week in regards to Genesis chapter 1, there's a lot happening in that chapter. And it's stuff that is happening behind the scenes, between the lines, underneath what we can typically read. Because it's a conversation that is happening a long time ago. Remember, we are not the first people to read Genesis chapter 1. We're not it by a long shot. People have been reading and discussing and teaching Genesis chapter 1 for literally thousands of years. In the context in which it was written, this is what is going on. The story lifts up a lot of things that the people of God, who are in this area, this white circle, that they confess about what they believe, what they confess about the God that they serve, that they follow, that has rescued them, that has a mission for them. All these things, and how this God and this story is different from the stories of, let's say, these people up here. I think this is the Hittite region up here, or maybe the Babylonians over here, I'm not sure what name to give the people over here, but I think this is the land of Ur and other places over here. And obviously this one is Egypt. All of these different places and people groups had their own version of how the world was made. Just for example, the Babylonian myth has the world being made out of the corpse of the dragon that the gods slew in bringing chaos under control, and out of that the world was made. Well, what we believe is that God didn't have to do any kind of contest or any kind of battle. It's just God said and God made. And God was the king. And God didn't have any real contest to make it happen. It just did. So all these different ways that this story was in competition, let's say, with the other ones going on around it. And then we move into Genesis chapter 2, which has its own version of how the world was made. It's a different order of operations. It starts not with a chaotic ocean with chaotic waters, but with a desert, a place where nothing was growing. Before any plant had sprung up from the ground, before any water had watered the ground, God formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And from there, everything started to sprout and grow. God planted a garden, and God brought the animals to Adam so that he might name them, but we found out that Adam is alone. And I could go into that story for a long time, but suffice it to say, Genesis chapters 2 through 11 is kind of seen to be one section in and of itself. The story begins in chapter 2, and it really carries all the way through to chapter 11. And there are questions that come up when we read Genesis chapter 2. And they're based off of what we heard and learned in chapter 1, which is God has said 7 times that this is good. So if that's true, if God created all things good, then what went wrong? Where did evil come from? And more importantly, what is God going to do about it? Genesis chapter 2, verse 4b through 11, verse 32, along with the rest of the Bible, really tackles these kinds of questions. How did things get so messed up? It's not too hard to look around in the world and see this is not ideal. Things are, let's say, broken or cursed even. People cannot coexist peacefully with one another. Why not? How did that get so out of balance? These stories give it a shot. Any questions, comments on on this first illustration? Just checking in. Doris, you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. Good deal. Glad it's working.
Actually, we think it's so terrible bad right now. It's been this way all the time, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, we're upset about how our world is right now and our whole everything, and they've been doing this since creation.
And it's nowhere near as bad as it has been.
No.
Not by a long shot, with how, at least in my neck of the woods, at least in our neck of the woods, things are not too bad. Things are really actually pretty darn good. But for the majority of human history, we've not had the American experiment, let's call it. So, good comment. Other thoughts before we move forward? And we take a deeper dive into what is in Genesis chapter 2 through 11. Okay, so the next page is called The Entry of Sin. Spoiler alert here. This illustration depicts, if you take a look back for us here on page 48, if you want to turn to that briefly, and I'll see how quickly I can do this. I'm going to bring up that illustration in Unit 3. At least I think so. Or maybe it's not worth it. I'll try it one more time here. Nope, maybe not. Just pause for a second while I clean up my mess. There's Unit 4, right? Okay. Open this one back up. Play in window. Very good, yes. And zoom in and start sharing again. I was hoping to be more nimble with this, but maybe we can't quite pull that off. But anyway, if you're on page 48 in the books, we see what God's original plan was. We see God as the king, and we see the representatives of humanity, the male and female figure, worshiping God by serving others and serving God and loving others, and all of humanity united because we're all on this planet together. And that's all it takes for us to be a community working together. So what exactly happened? Well, this is what happened. We have the entry of sin. And as we take a look at what happened to God's creation, out of right field comes this symbol on this lightning bolt. And if you recall this symbol, the circle going around with the arrow coming back to itself always, this is the symbol for sin. Martin Luther's definition of sin is to be curved in on oneself. And the effects of this act of disobedience, this act of being self-interested, self-concerned, selfish, and at the expense of everybody else, it shatters the order of God's creation. First and foremost, we're going through step by step here. The story in chapter 3 where Adam and Eve disobeyed God. We have these two characters here, the male and the female character right here in the middle, and God is on the other side. So Adam and Eve are now separated from God. Before this, God would walk in the garden in the cool of the day and have a chat, have a cup of coffee. But since the disobedience happened and they decided they can do it their own way, now all of a sudden there are consequences. There are repercussions, and they are separated from God. Moving forward, in chapter 4, it doesn't stop with Adam and Eve, but we go to the next story. Or actually, this is Adam and Eve, the male and the female, with the serpent the serpent tempting, and Adam and Eve making the choice, so that they're separated from each other. That's what this is. Adam and Eve are separated not only from God, but from each other. They are ashamed of exposure, of vulnerability, because they are naked. And so they're separated from each other. The trust is broken. Down here, number 3 is the story of Cain and Abel. We have the knife with the little drop of blood on it to represent that story of Cain murdering his brother. And so now families are feeling the effects of sin, so that brother is separated from brother, or worse than that in this case. If there's questions at any point, please just wave your hands or stop me. Number 4 here is that interesting detail that is just dropped into our story without really any explanation or any help in understanding what's going on. But in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, divine beings, the sons of God they are called, are intimate, sexually intimate with the women, with the daughters of men. And a quick comment, sons of God, that phrase does not refer to children, to biological descendants of God, but instead it refers to beings in the same category as, like how we would say sons of anarchy or sons of thunder. Anarchy didn't have children and produced these people. No, it's in the same category as. That is what that phrase is used as. And that is more in line with what Jesus says when he says Son of Man, and how the Bible says Son of God. That's a point of clarification that I wanted to throw in there too. But anyway, these beings, these gods, these Elohim, are violating the order even further when they cross that boundary. And so now it's not only male and female that are separated from one another and sibling that are separated from one another. Now it's the divine and the human. In general, before this has just been reserved for God himself, but now the other divine beings are separated, are causing havoc here. We'll come back to that at some extent a little bit later on here. Finally, as we make our way around the horn, we have number 5 here, which, can you see what's going on there? What is that symbol there that is separating these two human figures?
Looks like a big mouth to me.
Yes, that's what it is supposed to be. Do you know what that represents?
That we get in trouble with our talking.
Our talking gets us in trouble. That's absolutely true. But that refers to something specific that happens in Genesis chapter 11. Languages, our speech, where in the Tower of Babel story, now, because of humanity's arrogance and audacity to think that they can find God's realm by building a tower up into the heavens, and returning to God. God says, that's bad news. That's not going to bode well for them. And so God, in his mercy, scatters our languages. And after that, humanity is dispersed to all 4 corners of the globe, as it is understood then. And so by this point, the effects of sin have come into the picture, and just it gets worse and worse and worse as we go further in, until the point at which we are totally separated from each other and we can't even talk to each other. Thoughts on this? It's bad news. And this is God's judgment for sin as it enters the picture. It's not all it is. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. But any thoughts on this illustration here? Here's another look at the same idea, but just in a different way. So if we turn the page to page 62 and 63, it's the same sequence of events, the same chapters 2 through 11, but just illustrated in another way, in an additional way. The first story happened in the middle of these concentric circles. So we start in the middle, in the yellow, and the effects of sin are felt, first of all, in the garden with our first parents. And from there, it spills out. The first chapter 2 and 3, happened in the garden with our parents. Then chapter 4 comes along, and we've moved out of the garden, down the mountain, if you will, into the fields, and the effects are impacting the offspring. So we've moved out a level in both directions, and the next one is not the fields, but the cosmos itself, the heavenly realms, and the heavenly beings. And the effects are felt in the heavenly and the earthly characters in the story. And then Noah's story happens, but it doesn't fix anything. In fact, after the story of the flood, and after Noah and his family have been brought through the flood on the ark, and the ark comes to rest again, and they come out of the boat, and they start up again, God says, yeah, nothing's changed. I know that human beings are still full of wickedness all the time, every day. But I'm not going to do this again. I'm not ever again going to destroy the world with a flood. You have my word. So it's no different. The same situation, the same sin is still present. And through the stories of what happens to Abraham and to his descendants, it's the same thing. And after the flood story is the Tower of Babel story, where now we have a community of people, this circle of human beings, all with their hands on their hips to illustrate they are self-interested. They work together around this concept, building a tower. This is a ziggurat. It's what was found in Babylon. And this is kind of the idea. Babel is a word for Babylon. They're essentially the same word. But from there, humanity is scattered all over the face of the earth, and they can't even talk to each other. Questions on this idea, this illustration of how it just grows and continues to deteriorate? Remember that question, what is God going to do about it? How will God fix what is going on? Any thoughts? Turn page. Here is our last illustration for today, and it's the last of these passes through chapters 2 through 11. But we can see a pattern that is developing here. I'm going to move this down to the bottom here for a second. Excuse me. Abraham comes on the scene for the first time in Genesis chapter 11, verse 26. He is the first of the so-called chosen people, where God makes a covenant with him that will be the focus of everything else that happens in the rest of the Bible. In fact, I see we here have Bibles in front of us. Doris, I don't know if you have a Bible in front of you.
Yeah, I have one right here.
Well, let's just do a little exercise here.
Okay.
It was in one of the first pages of our unit here today, and I just kind of skipped right through it. But if you would find Genesis chapters 1 through 11, and just hold those chapters in between your fingers.
Okay.
So just holding that section, those 11 chapters,
Okay.
between your fingers.
1 through
11. So on this page, I see chapter 12 from there on, and it doesn't have to be exact, but just to give you an idea. When you see how many pages are in this section, now compare it to the rest of it. Now hold up the remaining chapters, the remaining pages of the Bible,
Oh,
and
my.
just see the difference here.
Yeah.
The point of this exercise is that Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are a prelude, are an overture, if you will. If you've ever been to a symphony or an opera or a musical, the overture is what happens with the orchestra. It's before the curtain goes up, actually. But the orchestra is playing through all the main themes that you will hear in the story coming up. It is supposed to give you kind of a place to start. And you'll start to recognize those themes as they come up through the course of the musical, through the course of the opera, through the course of the symphony. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 serve a very similar purpose, function. In fact, just Genesis 1, 2, and 3. It seems in so many ways like the rest of the Bible is just taking these themes, these ideas, and just riffing off of them, like a DJ would be playing the music and kind of, pushing the turntable back and forth to play the music over again and backwards and then forwards, and just having fun with it and developing it. The themes that are in here are developed for the next 2,000 years. And it's really fascinating when you start to catch on and you start to get familiar with these. The Bible comes to life in a way that is brand new to us anyway, in many cases, but has been the way the Bible's been working for thousands of years. Anyway, that's the exercise there. So now, turning back to page 64 and 65 in our book, the pattern that develops. We've talked about 4 main episodes, and the pattern is sin, judgment, and grace in each of these episodes. So just to run through those briefly. We start off at the very top of our timeline, and we have the creation account, with God calling the universe into existence, commanding the universe into existence. The sun, moon, the stars, the land, the sky, the seas, the birds, the fish, the animals, and humanity. All of it is good. It is told that, we are told that over and over again, 7 times. And once the fall happens, when this pattern begins to show forth. The sin in the first episode is obviously the decision to disobey God, to eat of the tree when God commanded us not to eat of the tree. And so that's the man and the woman and the serpent here. That is the sin that happens in the first one. The judgment in the first one is death. God warned them. God gave them the heads up that in the day you eat of this, death will be introduced. You will die. Grace in this episode is God's provision, God's providence of clothes for the man and the woman after they have become ashamed of their vulnerability, their exposure, their nakedness. God provides for them. So here's the first of those patterns that show forth. The second episode is the Cain and Abel story. Sin is obviously the murder that takes place. Judgment is after God confronts Cain about what he has done. God says, you must leave. You must go further from where the garden is. And then, of course, Cain cries out that when people see me, they will surely kill me after they know what I've done. Grace in this case is God saying, no, they won't. I will put a mark on you so that people will know that you are not to be touched. An interesting and a very deep rabbit hole that we could go down that I would need to prepare for much more myself. But again, sin, judgment, grace happens again. In the third episode with the flood story, the sin is what happens in the first 4 verses there in chapter 6, where the heavenly beings are intimate with the earthly beings, and it's causing chaos there. Judgment is God saying all humanity is all nothing but wickedness all the time, every day. And so the flood, where God steps out of the way and allows the chaos to come back. It's like God has been holding it back this whole time, but now God says, okay, if you're asking, are you sure you know what you're asking for? And God just steps out of the way and the floodgates are opened and the whole earth is covered up again. It's almost like the land falls away again, where God had brought it forth out of the waters. Now it has been succumbed by the waters. And of course, here the grace is the ark, God bringing Noah and his family and members of all of creation through the waters on the ark. Finally, We come to the last of these stories. I'm going to move this back to the top. In the Tower of Babel story, we have sin under the guise of arrogance, building a tower into the heavens. Judgment is God confusing their languages. But if the pattern holds true, what is grace in this case? I'm going to have to find a way to silence my notifications if we're doing this again next time. Grace in this case is Abraham. And grace in this case takes up the rest of the Bible. This response from God. We've come to it at last. God is saying, okay, enough of this cycle. All right, this is it. We're going forward from here. And if you're curious, this symbol for Abraham over here, this scrolls in this curriculum represent covenants. So the covenant that God made with Abraham, and it's a 3-part covenant. God promised Abraham a great family, so that's the second line in the covenant. God promised Abraham's family a land of their own, and so that's a little map right in here, and it's zoomed in on the promised land. And God promised that through Abraham and his family in that land, that he would bless the entire world. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a goblet of wine being tipped over onto the planet, onto the world right here. And that's what this curriculum does to show blessing onto the world. So Abraham is God's response to when things have gotten so messed up, so we're separated from each other. We don't even know who we are anymore, who they are anymore, and we can't even talk to each other. God calls Abraham. And that launches us into the rest of the Bible. Thoughts, comments, questions, anything at all? Does that kind of make sense? How that illustration works? You see the pattern?
We're just on a treadmill.
Yeah, we're on a treadmill. It's the same thing. And you develop, not that we didn't have one before, but we really develop a whole new appreciation for God as we take a closer look at what's in the Bible and all that God puts up with and all that God demonstrates for showing us who he is and what he cares about and what he's concerned about. And yeah, it's interesting. The reading for this Sunday that I got my sermon done today for that. It's on the story in Exodus chapter 4 when God appears to Moses in the burning bush. And it's at that point that we first hear that God gets angry in the Bible. And this is after all of this, all of these stories and all of the Abraham stories that we'll take a closer look at next time, and all of the Jacob stories and all of the frustration. It takes God a long time to get to that point where he's actually angry. It's not the flood story. In the flood story, it says that God is deeply grieved, not necessarily angry, but that God regretted what God had done. So anyway, a lot of this, almost all of it, is developing God's character. Who is this God? And a lot of times that's kind of the forgotten element. You know what I mean? In Sunday school lessons, we learn about the story, we learn about what the people did, what, maybe the miracle that happened in it, the great sign that God demonstrating God's power. But this is really a story about God. It's a love story. So, thoughts?
He had a lot of patience with us, didn't he?
A lot of patience, for sure. God is slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, full of compassion, merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And that much is explicitly stated in Exodus chapter 34. God says that about himself. Good. Thoughts? Comments? All right. That is all for this unit then. I will stop the screen sharing.
Okay, just letting you know that it was Michelle's last day today here. Michelle Vanya was
Wow.
her last day,
Yep.
and it was kind of emotional. She's been here a long, long time.
Yes, she has. I knew that she was stepping down.
Uh-huh.
I'm glad it sounds like they've found
We all
something
had to write on little cards some thoughts for her.
that's tremendous.
And my thought was way back when Lloyd's Aunt Irma was dying. And this had to been 20 years ago or 25. And that's when the Lord really tested me, because Irma had my hand and wasn't going to let me go. And for 12 hours, I sat by her bedside and she wouldn't let go. And she kept saying, I'm ready to go. Pray now. I'm ready to die. I'm ready to die. And Michelle was on one side of the bed and I was on the other, and Michelle would not leave. It was her time for her, duty was over, and she was not going to leave me. So I've always had a real soft spot for Michelle. And then she said, okay, I think she stopped breathing. And then all of a sudden, and away she'd go again.
Mhm.
And we kept doing this for 12 hours. And then finally, when she finally went, it was the most gorgeous smile I've ever seen in my life. And Michelle looked at me and said, we missed something. We didn't get to see what she just saw.
There's another part of that story.
It was awesome. It was worth all those hours just to see this beautiful. And there definitely was. She was seeing something that we didn't see. And Michelle said, I feel cheated. We didn't get to see what she just saw.
Yep.
That was pretty.
That is a very special person who just worked her last day at the care center, but certainly it's a well-deserved
Oh yeah.
rest that
She
she's gonna get.
just goes beyond everything and to do so.
Real quick, I'm going to end the live stream here with a thank you to all the
Okay.
people who are watching.